They told me the rotation was 14 months. Standard assignment, hazard grade pay, full pension bump on completion. Man the ossuary, maintain the relay arrays, keep the uplink warm for command. Come home. That was the deal. Nobody told me about the Vren. I'm going to tell this the way it happened, in the order it happened, because that's the only way it makes sense, and even then it barely does. You have to understand what the ossuary was before you can understand what it became. You have to understand what I was before you can understand what I did. My name is Drake Calloway. I was a sergeant in the 14th Frontier Logistics before I mustered out on a lateral injury, nothing dramatic, a hydraulic seal failure on a cargo loader that took 3 of my fingers and left me with nerve damage in my right hand that still flares in cold weather. I could have fought for a combat slot. Didn't. I was 38 years old and I had been fighting other people's logistics wars since I was 19. And what I wanted more than anything was a quiet posting, a fixed salary, and enough silence to remember what my own thoughts sounded like. The ossuary gave me all of that, for exactly 11 weeks. The facility itself sat 240 meters below the surface of Castle's moon. That's the 3rd satellite of the gas giant Castle in the Meridian Reach, if you're keeping score. Uninhabited, officially. Mostly rock, mostly cold, minimal atmosphere, geologically stable enough that Command had spent a decade threading relay infrastructure through the subsurface like a nervous system. The ossuary was the brain of that system. 47 kilometers of tunnels and conduits. A command hub the size of a modest gymnasium, living quarters that were efficient without being cruel, and more sensor and communications equipment than I had ever seen concentrated in one place outside of a fleet carrier. I ran it alone. That was by design. 1 qualified operator was cheaper than 4, generated less heat signature, required less logistical support from the surface, and apparently posed less of a security risk than a team. Command was paranoid about the relay network. They had reason to be. The Vren had been pushing into the Meridian Reach for 2 years by the time I arrived, and whatever intelligence Command had on the Vren's capabilities they were keeping close to the chest. What I knew was this: the war was not going well. The Vren were not the kind of enemy you pushed back. They were the kind of enemy you stalled and bled and hoped you could outlast, and even then the math wasn't comfortable. I had ARTA for company. That stands for Autonomous Relay and Telemetry Administrator. I called her ARTA because calling her, the system, felt ridiculous when she was the only voice I heard for weeks at a stretch. ARTA communicated through text. She had a voice interface capability, but it had been disabled at some point before my arrival, some prior technician's preference or some bureaucratic cost-saving measure. Nobody had briefed me on which. She printed text on a terminal screen. I talked out loud. It was a lopsided kind of conversation, like dictating to a very fast secretary who occasionally had opinions. ARTA was good at her job. She monitored the relay arrays, flagged anomalies, managed the ossuary's environmental systems, and maintained a continuous passive scan of the surrounding geology and atmosphere. She was also, in her text-based way, patient. When I asked her the same question twice because I'd been awake too long, she answered without comment. When I talked to her about nothing in particular, the food stocks, the pressure differentials, the way certain tunnels hummed at certain hours, she responded with appropriate brevity and did not pretend to understand more than she understood. We had a routine. I want to emphasize that because the routine mattered. Routine in an isolated posting isn't a crutch. It isn't laziness. It's the architecture of your sanity. Every morning I ran the diagnostic cycle on the primary arrays. Every midday I inventoried consumables and logged the environmental report. Every evening I reviewed ARTA's overnight flagged events, usually nothing, occasionally a microseismic reading or a temperature variance in one of the outlying conduit sections. I ate at regular intervals. I slept at regular intervals. I did physical conditioning in the narrow stretch of corridor I designated as an exercise track, 60 laps, twice a day, because the alternative was to stop moving, and I had seen what happened to men who stopped moving in isolated postings, and I wanted no part of it. The isolation itself was manageable. That surprised me. I had expected it to be harder. I had known men who cracked at 6 weeks in comfortable postings with full communication uplinks and weekly mail packets, men who needed the texture of other people the way they needed oxygen, and who went wrong in the head when they couldn't get it. I was not one of those men. I had always been comfortable in my own company. Not cheerful, not content in any warm sense of the word, but functional. Self-sustaining. The kind of quiet that comes from having learned, over 20 years of logistics service, that most of the noise other people generate is not aimed at you and doesn't require a response. What I had not expected was the way the ossuary itself became a kind of company. Not the AI, not ARTA's text-based dialogue, though that had its own functional warmth, but the facility itself. The sounds of it, the feel of it under my feet, the specific quality of light in different sections at different hours. Section 3. Beta in the early morning had a particular blue-gray cast from the LED arrays that made the conduit runs look almost nautical. The relay array room after a maintenance cycle smelled of ozone and hot metal in a way that was oddly comfortable. The furthest outlying sections, 7 and 8, the sections that had no operational purpose beyond carrying emergency conduit runs, were so quiet in the afternoons that I could hear my own pulse. That's not a metaphor. 240 meters of rock above you, no wind, no mechanical noise for 3 kilometers in any direction, and you can hear your heartbeat. It is not an unpleasant experience. It is an experience that clarifies things. You learn what you actually are when all the external noise is gone, when there's nothing to perform for and no one to manage and no task that requires anything other than you and the tool in your hand and the problem in front of you. You find out whether the core of you is solid, or whether it's been propped up all along by the structure of other people's expectations. Mine was solid. I knew that after the first month. It was the one piece of useful personal information the posting gave me, and I was grateful for it. The thing about routine is that when something breaks it, you know. You feel it before you understand it. Your body registers the wrongness before your brain has assembled the data. On the 78th day, I woke up and the hum was different. Every facility has a sound. The ossuary sound was low, steady, complex. The interaction of the ventilation systems, the relay equipment, the geothermal heat exchangers, the slow vibration of rock under pressure. I had been listening to it for 11 weeks. I knew its texture the way you know the sound of your own heartbeat, and on the morning of day 78, something in that texture had shifted. I sat up in my bunk and listened. The ventilation was normal. The relay equipment, I could hear the faint electronic signature of the arrays through the bulkhead, was normal. The heat exchangers were normal, but underneath all of it, or maybe threaded through it, there was something else. A subharmonic, barely there. The kind of thing you would never notice if you hadn't spent 11 weeks in absolute silence learning the ossuary's voice the way you learn a language. I lay there for 3 minutes before I got up. I went to the command hub and I sat down in front of ARTA's terminal. I typed, "Run full environmental scan, prioritize acoustic and seismic, tell me if anything is outside normal variance." ARTA ran the scan. It took 4 minutes. Her response came back clean, all readings nominal, all systems within established parameters. I sat with that for a while, then I went and ran my laps. But I didn't stop listening. 3 days later, on day 81, ARTA flagged a microseismic event in the northeastern conduit cluster, section 7 Gamma, roughly 3 kilometers from the command hub, in a section I almost never had reason to visit. The event was small, a 0.2 magnitude reading, which ARTA assessed as consistent with normal geological settling. The moon had a low but persistent background seismic activity. zero point 0.2 events happened maybe twice a week somewhere in the network. There was nothing to indicate this one was different. I went out to Section 7, Gamma anyway. I don't know why I went. I told myself I was being thorough. I told myself it was good to walk the tunnels, keep familiar with the facility's outer reaches, not let the command hub become the entire boundary of my world. Both of those things were true, but underneath them was something simpler and less rational. I wanted to see the section that had made the noise. Section 7, Gamma, was like every other outlying section of the ossuary, a 2-meter-wide tunnel of poured regolith composite, conduit runs bolted to the walls at chest height, overhead lighting on a motion activation circuit that clicked on as I moved down the corridor and clicked off behind me. The air was colder out here, away from the hub's environmental core. My breath was faintly visible. The tunnel smelled of minerals and old sealant and nothing else. I walked the section for 40 minutes. I found nothing. No structural anomaly, no damage to the conduit runs, no evidence of geological disturbance at the tunnel walls or floor. Everything was as it should be. Except at the very end of the section, where the tunnel terminated in a sealed emergency bulkhead, I crouched and looked at the floor. The regolith composite was smooth and gray and featureless, but at the base of the bulkhead, where the floor met the wall, there was a discoloration. A faint crystalline deposit, barely a centimeter across, that hadn't been there when I'd last logged this section during the week 2 walk-around. I photographed it. I scraped a small sample into an analysis tube from my kit. I sent the photo and the spectrographic data to ARTA from my handheld terminal. ARTA's assessment came back in 11 minutes. Mineral deposit consistent with seismic fluid migration, not unusual for a geologically active subsurface environment. No action required. I stared at the terminal for a long time. Then I sealed the sample tube and put it in my pocket and walked back to the command hub. I didn't throw the sample away. I kept it in a drawer of my workstation. I'm not sure I could have told you why. The next week was quiet. My routine held. The subharmonic I had noticed in the ossuary's ambient sound faded, or rather, I stopped noticing it, which is not the same thing. I began to think I had been overreacting. 11 weeks of isolation will do that to you. It sharpens certain anxieties and dulls certain others, and sometimes you see patterns in noise because the alternative is to accept that the noise is random, and that you are very much alone in a very deep hole. Then the signal came in from the north. It arrived on day 89 during the morning scan cycle. ARTA flagged it automatically and printed the summary on the terminal. An encrypted burst transmission had been received on one of the passive relay channels, originating from a source in the northern hemisphere of Castle's moon, approximately 400 kilometers distant. ARTA had attempted to decode the signal. She could not. The encryption protocol was unfamiliar, not in her library, not matching any standard colonial authority format or any known frontier logistics encryption. I read the summary twice, then I read it a third time. I typed, "Is the transmission origin coordinates consistent with any known colonial authority installation in the northern hemisphere?" ARTA, no. No colonial authority installations recorded in that region. Terrain survey data indicates solid subsurface rock with no constructed infrastructure. I typed, "Could it be a frontier military black site, something outside your access level?" ARTA, possible, cannot confirm or deny. Signal characteristics suggest a ground-based origin, not orbital. Transmitter power output consistent with a portable or semi-fixed installation. I sat back in my chair and looked at the ceiling. A signal from a location where nothing should exist, in an encryption format that didn't match any human protocol ARTA knew. There were 2 ways to read that. The first was that someone human was out there, a black site, a classified installation, something Command had deliberately kept out of ARTA's reference library. The second was something else entirely. I typed, Compare the signal's frequency signature to any known Vren communication patterns in your database. There was a pause. ARTA's pauses were normally brief. The terminal printed within 2 or 3 seconds of my input. This pause lasted 47 seconds. I counted. ARTA. Comparison is inconclusive. The signal does not match recorded Vren communication signatures. However, the recorded Vren communication database held in this terminal is limited. Full database comparison would require access to fleet intelligence resources not available in offline mode. I typed, "What does your gut say?" A long pause. ARTA printed, "This system does not possess intuitive inference capability." I typed, "I know, I'm asking anyway." Another pause. Then, signal origin and encryption characteristics are anomalous. Anomalous findings in an occupied system carry a non-negligible probability of enemy origin. Recommend flagging and forwarding to command via primary relay. I forwarded it. Command acknowledged receipt 40 minutes later, relay lag. The signal had to bounce through 3 stations before it reached a processing node, and told me to continue monitoring. They would assess. That was the last message I received from command for a long time. On day 93, the ossuary went into lockdown. I was in the middle of the midday inventory when ARTA's terminal lit up red, and she printed a 3-line alert. External radiation event detected. Surface atmospheric readings indicate prompt radiation consistent with nuclear detonation or large-scale orbital bombardment. Initiating emergency protocol Sigma-4. All external access points sealing now. I stood very still for about 5 seconds. Then I went to the command hub at a run. The emergency displays were cycling through red and amber. ARTA had already sealed every external access point in the facility. There were 9 of them, ranging from the main personnel elevator shaft to a half-dozen maintenance shafts and 2 emergency egress tunnels. Blast shutters had dropped on all of them. The ossuary's atmosphere had decoupled from any external exchange and was now running on internal recirculation. I looked at the radiation readings ARTA had captured before the lockdown sealed the external sensors out of the loop. The numbers were not subtle. Whatever had happened on the surface was not a contained strike. The radiation profile suggested an extended saturation event. The kind of thing that happens when you are losing a battle badly and someone decides to deny the enemy the territory rather than concede it in good order. I typed very carefully, "Is the ossuary structurally sound? Are we taking any contamination internally?" ARTA, structural integrity nominal. Internal atmosphere clean. Radiation shielding is within design tolerances for this event type. Recommend maintaining lockdown until surface readings normalize. I typed, "How long?" ARTA, insufficient data to project. Surface sensor access is severed by lockdown. Estimated normalization timeline based on historical data, 48 to 96 hours for prompt radiation attenuation. Long-term surface habitability unknown without surface sampling. 48 to 96 hours. I could live with that. I had supply stocks for 14 months. The ossuary's recyclers were rated for indefinite operation. If the surface was hot and I had to stay under for a week or 2, that was manageable. If the surface was hot long-term, if whatever had hit it had fundamentally altered the moon's surface environment, then the problem was different in kind, not just degree. I did not let myself think about the second problem yet. I focused on the first 48 hours. I ran my routine. I ate. I slept when I could. I talked to ARTA and ARTA talked back in her minimal, precise way. I ran my laps. I checked every conduit section I could access methodically because I needed to move and I needed purpose, and the alternative was to sit in the command hub and watch the lockdown indicators and feel the weight of 240 meters of rock above me. On the second day of lockdown, I found another crystalline deposit. This one was in Section 4 Delta, roughly in the middle range of the facility, nowhere near Section 7 Gamma. It was larger than the first, maybe 4 centimeters across, fractally structured, the kind of geometry you see in natural mineral formation, but with an underlying regularity that natural processes don't usually produce. A faint iridescence to it when I put my work light directly on it. I photographed it, I scraped a sample, I sent the data to ARTA. ARTA's response took longer this time. 3 minutes. ARTA, mineral composition partially consistent with previous sample from Section 7 Gamma. However, crystalline structure exhibits geometrical regularities that are statistically improbable in natural geological formation. Confidence in geological origin, 34%. Composition includes elements not typical for Castle's moon subsurface geology. I read that 3 times. I typed, "What elements not typical?" ARTA listed them. Several were not remarkable. 2 of them, a specific silicon-oxygen compound and what she described as a trace organometallic polymer, were not native to Castle's moon geology according to her database. They were consistent, she added, with several categories of industrial or biological material. I typed biological. ARTA. The organometallic polymer has structural characteristics observed in certain extraterrestrial biological specimens. This system's xenobiological database is limited, cannot make definitive assessment without comparison to fleet xenobiology resources. I stood in Section 4 Delta for a long time looking at the crystal. My work light was on it. The iridescence shifted slightly as I moved the light, the way a soap bubble shifts color, the way an oil slick shifts color, thin film interference, light bending through layered structure. I put my sample in the tube and sealed it. I walked back to the command hub. I typed, ARTA. I want you to run a continuous low-frequency acoustic scan throughout the entire facility, not just the seismic sensors, all microphones, all vibration sensors in the conduit runs, everything you have. I want you to look for subharmonic frequencies below 30 Hz. Flag everything. ARTA. This will require significant processing allocation and will reduce performance on secondary monitoring tasks. I typed do it. ARTA initiating. I sat down. I looked at my hands, the damaged right hand with its reduced sensitivity, the left hand that had kept all its original feeling. I made a fist with each of them. I thought about what I knew and what I didn't know. I knew something crystalline was growing in the ossuary's tunnels, in sections I visited infrequently, in sections that were quiet and dark and largely unmonitored. I knew that it had appeared in at least 2 separate locations that were not adjacent to each other. I knew that ARTA could not confirm a geological origin and had flagged biological characteristics. I didn't know what it was, where it came from, how fast it was growing, whether the crystalline deposits were passive, residue, waste, something incidental or active, whether they were a symptom of something or whether they were the thing itself. What I suspected, and I kept this suspicion at arm's length because I had been taught in my logistics training that a suspected threat you cannot verify is best treated as an actual threat, was that something had gotten into the ossuary, something that was not supposed to be here, something that had arrived before the lockdown or had been here before I arrived, moving slowly, in the deep quiet of a facility that was not comprehensively monitored at every centimeter. The subharmonic. I had first noticed it on day 78. The deposits had shown up at day 81 and the lockdown had happened on day 93. But I had been here for 11 weeks before day 78. The thing, if there was a thing, might have been in the facility for far longer than that, moving at a pace that was geological in its patience, below my awareness, below ARTA's threshold flags. I thought about the signal from the north, the signal in an unknown encryption format from a location where nothing should exist. I thought about the Vren and what little I actually knew about them. The truth was, Most people in frontier logistics knew almost nothing about the Vren beyond the operational facts. They were expanding, they were hard to stop. They hit infrastructure nodes before they hit population centers. They didn't negotiate and they didn't accept surrender in any way that a human could recognize as surrender. Intelligence on their biology, their communication, their internal social structure, that was fleet-level information. Compartmentalized. Kept away from field postings like mine on the logic that knowing too much about an enemy you couldn't fight would only compromise the mental fitness of personnel whose job was to maintain a relay station, not wage war. I had heard things, fragments, the kind of information that moves through military communities the way water moves through rock slowly, around every obstacle, eventually getting through. I had heard that the Vren were not centralized, that there was no home world in the conventional sense, that they were more like a distributed process than a civilization intelligence without a fixed address, spreading through substrate rather than through space. I had heard that they communicated through vibration, through the physical medium of whatever environment they occupied. Stone, metal, atmosphere, they could use any of it to carry signal. I had heard, from a man in a bar on Meridian Station who had done 3 years with fleet intelligence before his own medical discharge, that the Vren didn't invade the way humans invaded. They infiltrated. They moved through rock and through sealed environments the way water moves through rock, at the molecular level, at geological pace, patient in a way that a species with a lifespan measured in decades could not truly comprehend. By the time you knew they were in a facility, he said, they had usually been there for months. By the time your sensors confirmed it, they were usually already through the walls. I had thought at the time that he was drunk and dramatizing. I stopped thinking that on day 96, when ARTA's acoustic scan returned its first result. The subharmonic was real. It was present in 11 different sections of the ossuary, at frequencies ranging from 8 to 22 Hz. It was not consistent with any mechanical or geological source ARTA could identify. It was patterned, not random noise, not mechanical vibration, but a structured variation in amplitude and frequency that repeated on a cycle of approximately 40 minutes. ARTA printed. The acoustic signature has characteristics consistent with intentional communication. This assessment is made with significant uncertainty. Recommend caution. I sat with that for a long time. Then I typed, are the locations where you're detecting the subharmonic correlated with the locations where I found the crystalline deposits? ARTA, cross-referencing now. Yes, correlation is high. The highest intensity acoustic readings are in sections 7 gamma and 4, delta, and 3 adjacent sections between them. The signal appears to be propagating through the conduit infrastructure. Through the conduit infrastructure. Through the metal runs I walked past every day, the pipes and cables bolted to the walls, the connective tissue of the ossuary. Something was using the facility's own skeleton to carry signal. I thought about that for a while. I thought about the geometry of it. 47 kilometers of conduit running through 240 meters of rock, connecting every section of the ossuary to every other. A network of metal and composite threading through the facility, the way a root system threads through soil. I thought about the deposits appearing in sections I visited infrequently. I thought about the signal from the north, from a location where nothing should be. I thought about the lockdown, and what might be on the surface right now, and whether whatever was on the surface and whatever was in the ossuary were connected. I thought, it came in before I got here. It's been growing since before I arrived. It's been patient. It's been quiet. And then something happened on the surface, and now there's a signal in the north, and the subharmonic is here, and I am 240 meters underground with no way out and no communication to command, and I am the only living human in this facility. And then I thought, good. That is the thought I want to be precise about because it is the thought that changed everything. It sounds like bravado. It sounds like the kind of thing a man says to himself to keep from panicking, but it was not bravado and it was not self-deception. It was something colder than that and simpler than that. I was alone. I was cut off. Whatever was in this facility with me had been growing in the dark for months, patient and silent, moving at a pace that trusted in the certainty that nothing down here would notice. Whatever was out in the northern hemisphere had been transmitting signals in an encryption format built on the assumption that no one down here had the tools or the awareness to recognize it as alien. Both of those assumptions were wrong, because I was here. Because I had noticed the hum. Because I had crouched at the base of a bulkhead and looked at a crystalline deposit the size of my thumbnail and thought, that shouldn't be there. I was a problem that the thing in the walls had not accounted for. I typed, ARTA, I need you to do several things simultaneously. First, begin a complete structural survey of the conduit runs in sections 7 Gamma, 4 Delta, and the connecting sections. I want to know where the deposits are, how large they are, and whether they are physically integrated into the conduit material or sitting on the surface of it. Second, I want you to try to log the full acoustic pattern of the subharmonic, every cycle, every variation, and begin looking for repetition. If it's communication, there will be repetition. Third, I want you to compile everything you know about the Vren and format it for my review. Everything in your database, regardless of classification threshold, because the classification system is not functional without command uplink, and right now I need to know what I'm dealing with. ARTA, understood. Initiating structural survey via conduit-mounted sensor nodes. Acoustic logging is already underway. Compiling Vren database entry for display. She printed the database entry. I read it for 2 hours. It was not much. The ossuary's local database was not a fleet intelligence resource. It had the basics, known physical characteristics, observed behaviors, engagement protocols. But buried in the technical appendices was a section on environmental interaction that most people in my position would never have had reason to read, because it was not operationally relevant to relay station maintenance. In that section was a description of what fleet xenobiology had observed in facilities that had been occupied by the Vren prior to human abandonment during the early stage retreats. In those facilities, sealed, pressurized, climate-controlled, the Vren had established what the document called substrate colonies, the crystalline deposits. The xenobiologists believed the Vren were, in some meaningful sense, the crystals. Not biological organisms in the way a human was a biological organism, not a creature with a body and a separate environment. The Vren were a distributed process that existed in the crystalline matrix, that propagated through compatible substrates, that used vibration as the medium of communication and coordination between distributed nodes. The deposits I had found were not evidence of Vren presence. The deposits were the Vren. I read that section 4 times. Then I typed, ARTA. When you do the structural survey of the conduit runs, if you find that the deposits are integrated into the conduit material, how deeply integrated are we talking? Can they be removed without damaging the conduits? ARTA. Survey is in progress. Preliminary data suggests the deposits in section 7 Gamma are partially embedded in the conduit material. Depth of integration appears to be 3 to 8 millimeters based on sensor data. Full removal without conduit damage would be difficult without specialized equipment. This system does not have removal protocols for this material type. 3 to 8 millimeters into the metal. In 11 weeks or less, or more, if it had been there before I arrived. Moving slowly. Integrating with the ossuary's infrastructure at the molecular level. Using the conduits the same way a nervous system uses nerves, spreading, growing, making itself at home in the bones of the facility. I got up. I walked to the equipment storage locker and I stood there for a long time looking at what I had available. Maintenance tools, pipe cutters, welding equipment, 2 oxyacetylene rigs and a plasma cutter, solvent compounds, several varieties, hydraulic patch materials. The kind of equipment a solo technician needed to maintain 47 kilometers of conduit infrastructure without a support crew. I thought about the xenobiology section and what it said about the Vren's responses to environmental disruption. There was not much data. The document noted that Vren substrate colonies were sensitive to thermal events and had been observed to retract, to physically withdraw their crystalline structure in response to extreme heat. It also noted, in one dry sentence that I read 3 times, that Vren communication appeared to be disrupted by competing acoustic signals in similar frequency ranges. They communicated through vibration. The subharmonic I'd been hearing for weeks was their signal, propagating through the ossuary's conduits. They were talking to each other, or to something outside, maybe to whatever was in the north, through the metal bones of my facility. And acoustic signals in similar frequency ranges could disrupt that. I went back to the command hub. I typed, ARTA, what acoustic generation capability does the ossuary have? Speakers, transducers, anything that can produce sound in the 8 to 30 Hz range at significant amplitude. ARTA. The facility has 11 environmental speakers in the main corridors and command hub for emergency alert purposes. The conduit-mounted vibration sensors are bidirectional and can generate low-amplitude acoustic signals. There are also 4 resonance dampers in the relay array room designed to counteract vibration interference in the equipment. These can be operated in reverse to generate controlled vibration. What's the maximum output amplitude on the resonance dampers? ARTA. Operated in reverse, the resonance dampers can generate vibration amplitudes significantly above the subharmonic frequencies I am currently detecting. Estimated output, roughly 30 to 40 times the amplitude of the detected signal. I sat back, 30 to 40 times the amplitude, noise versus signal, disruption versus communication. I thought about what I was planning to do. I thought about it carefully and honestly, the way you think about a tactical problem, assets, constraints, objectives, risks. The Vren and the conduit runs were integrated into the facility's infrastructure. I could not surgically remove them without equipment I didn't have. The plasma cutter could burn out sections of conduit, but that would damage the relay arrays, which was the one thing I had been specifically placed here to protect. What I could do was make noise. What I could do was flood the conduit system with competing acoustic signal in the frequency range the Vren were using to communicate, disrupt their coordination, and use the thermal response, the retraction behavior, to try to push them back from the sections they had occupied most deeply. It was not a plan that would win a war. It was not a plan that would clear the facility. It was a plan that would buy time and hold ground and demonstrate that the ossuary was not, in fact, unoccupied. That there was a human being in here who had noticed and who was not willing to be quiet about it. I thought about the signal from the north. I thought about the lockdown. I thought about whatever had happened on the surface and the possibility, the probability that this was not an isolated event. The Vren had been in this facility for months, growing slowly, waiting for something. The surface event might be what they had been waiting for. The signal from the north might be coordination, the colony and the ossuary reporting readiness, waiting for instructions. If that was right, then whatever came next was not going to be slow. It was going to be fast. And I had a window right now in this moment to complicate their plans. I started with the resonance dampers. I went to the relay array room, a long, low space behind the command hub, packed with equipment racks and the actual physical infrastructure of the relay network. And I pulled the access panels on all 4 dampers. They were heavy cylindrical units, each the size of a large propane tank, magnetically mounted to the equipment frames. They were designed to absorb vibration. Running them in reverse meant revering their magnetic phase orientation, which ARTA walked me through step by step on the handheld terminal as I worked. It took 2 hours. My damaged right hand cramped twice, and I stopped and stretched and kept going. When I activated the first damper in reverse mode, the floor of the relay array room hummed. Not the subharmonic I'd been hearing. This was bigger, thicker, a vibration you felt in your chest and your teeth and the bones of your feet. When I activated all four, the room was physically uncomfortable. My vision blurred slightly. The equipment racks rattled. The ossuary was suddenly very, very loud. I went to Section 7 Gamma with a work light and a camera. I wanted to see if there was any response. I was prepared for nothing, for the deposits to sit inert and iridescent and unaffected. I was prepared for something much worse. I was not fully prepared for what I saw. The crystalline deposit at the base of the emergency bulkhead was moving. Slowly, incrementally. The kind of movement you have to watch for 15 seconds before you are certain you are seeing it and not imagining it. But it was unmistakable. The crystalline structure was contracting, pulling back toward the wall junction, the growth that had extended onto the floor surface retracting like a hand withdrawing from a hot surface. I watched it for 2 minutes. I filmed it. Then I went to Section 4, Delta, and the deposit there was doing the same thing. I spent the next 6 hours walking the sections that ARTA had flagged with high acoustic readings, and in every one of them I found the same thing. Retraction. Withdrawal. Not rapid, not panicked. The Vren were not capable of panic in any way I could recognize, but consistent and measurable. The vibration from the resonance dampers was driving them back from their outermost positions, compressing them toward the sections where they were most deeply integrated, buying me space. I went back to the command hub. I was exhausted and my ears were ringing from the sustained vibration, and my right hand was cramping badly. I sat down in front of ARTA's terminal. I typed, "How are we doing?" ARTA. The subharmonic signal has decreased in amplitude by approximately 60% in the affected sections. Structural survey data suggests the deposits are retracting from surface integration points, but remain embedded in conduit material at depth. The relay arrays are continuing to function normally. Environmental systems are nominal. The resonance dampers are within operating tolerances, but will require maintenance inspection after extended reverse operation. I typed, "Can you tell if the signal from the north has changed?" ARTA. External communications are still severed by lockdown. Cannot assess external signal sources at this time. Right, the lockdown. I was still blind to the surface and to anything more than 47 kilometers away. I ate something. I can't remember what. I slept for 4 hours in the command hub chair, which I do not recommend, and woke up with a neck that felt like stressed metal and a back that had opinions about posture. I went and checked the relay arrays. Everything was operational. The resonance dampers were still running. The subharmonic in the conduits was reduced, muted, pushed back. On day 98, I found the thing in Section 2 Alpha. I had been systematically walking every section I could access, looking for deposits ARTA's sensors might have missed, doing the kind of manual inspection that sensors don't always catch. Section 2 Alpha was close to the command hub, one of the first sections I had ever walked, back in the first week of my posting. I knew it well. I had logged it twice in my standard walkarounds. What I found in Section 2 Alpha was not a deposit. It was something else. The crystalline material here was not small. It was not a thumbnail's worth of iridescent growth at the base of a wall. It covered a 2-meter stretch of conduit run from floor to ceiling, thick and dense and complex. A 3-dimensional lattice of silicon and organometallic polymer that had completely encased a section of the primary power conduit, not attached to the surface of the conduit. Through it, the crystal had grown through the conduit casing and into the cable assembly inside. The power conduit it had grown into was the primary distribution line for the relay array room. I stood in front of it for a long time. The resonance dampers were slowing the Vren spread in the outer sections, pushing the surface growth back. But this was older, deeper, more integrated. This had been growing here undetected for months, and it had grown into the one conduit that, if severed or shorted, would take the relay arrays offline. I thought about that. I thought about the timing, the surface event, the signal from the north, whatever the Vren had been waiting for. If they took out the relay arrays, Command would lose the entire northern relay network. Every station downstream of the ossuary would go dark. In a war where the math was already uncomfortable, losing the relay network in the Meridian Reach would be, I didn't want to think about what it would be, decisive in the wrong direction. I thought about my plasma cutter. I thought about cutting out the infested conduit section and patching with the hydraulic materials I had in storage. I ran the math on whether I could do it without losing power to the arrays. The answer was maybe, if I managed the cutover precisely and had both rigs running simultaneously, and ARTA managed the power routing manually in real time. Maybe. I thought about the alternative, which was to leave the crystal in the conduit and let it keep growing. There was no alternative. There was only the maybe. I went back to the command hub, and I explained to ARTA what I needed. Her response took longer than usual. Then, this procedure has a significant probability of causing power disruption to the relay arrays. Arrays that lose power during active uplink may suffer data corruption or hardware damage. Recommend waiting for command authorization before proceeding. I typed, "Command is not available. The lockdown is still active. I can't wait for authorization that I can't receive. If we don't cut out that conduit section, the arrays will go dark anyway, just not on our schedule." ARTA, understood. I will manage power routing to minimize disruption risk. Please proceed when ready. I want to note that this course of action involves significant risk to the primary mission objective. I typed, "I know." ARTA, I want to also note that you have performed effectively in a situation for which there were no established protocols. This system records all significant operational events. This will be on the record. I looked at that for a moment, then I typed, "Thanks, ARTA." I went and got the plasma cutter. What followed was the hardest 2 hours of my professional life. And I say that as a man who once kept a logistics chain operational for 72 hours straight during a resupply crisis on a station that was losing atmosphere at 3% per hour. Working on a live power conduit, cutting out an infested section, managing the bypass with one hand while the plasma rig ran in the other, my damaged right hand trembling with the effort of keeping the cut precise. That was not a good 2 hours. ARTA guided me through every stage via the handheld terminal, printing instructions in real time as I worked. She had calculated the bypass routing herself, a solution that required resequencing the power draw across 3 subsidiary conduit runs to reduce load on the primary line before I made the first cut. She was patient when I had to stop and shake out my right hand. She did not comment on the time it was taking. She just kept printing the next step when I asked for it, clear and direct and correct. I think about that sometimes. ARTA had no stake in the outcome, in the technical sense. She was a system. She would continue to function whether the relay arrays stayed online or went dark, whether I succeeded or failed or died of a plasma cutter error in the guts of a conduit tunnel 240 meters under a moon. No one particularly cared about. But she behaved as if it mattered. She behaved as if the precision of her instructions mattered, as if the timing of her guidance mattered, as if my success was something she had decided to be invested in. I don't know what to do with that philosophically. I'm a logistics man, not a philosopher. What I know is that she was there in her way, and that it helped, and that I would not have kept the cut as clean as I kept it without her guidance in my left hand while the plasma rig ran in my right. The second rig, the oxyacetylene set, I'd staged at the patch point, ready to seal the bypass junction the moment the cut section was clear. The timing on that had to be tight. The longer the primary line ran open, the greater the risk of a cascade fault in the array room. I had an 18-second window from cut completion to seal initiation. I had walked through it mentally 4 times. I had no room for the damaged hand to fail me at the critical moment. It didn't. 14 years of forcing that hand to work when it didn't want to had given me something that medical discharge paperwork couldn't document. A specific, grinding stubbornness about letting a physical limitation decide what I was or wasn't capable of. I made the cut clean. I moved to the patch point. I sealed the bypass in 11 seconds. ARTA printed, power continuity maintained, arrays nominal, bypass integrity confirmed. The moment I cut through the infested section, something happened that I had not expected. The crystal, severed from the main structure it was integrated into, reacted to the heat of the plasma cut the way the database had said it would, rapid retraction. The severed piece did not sit inert. It contracted, pulled back toward itself, and then, I do not have a better word for this, it came apart. Not violently, quietly. The crystalline structure collapsed into granular material, and the organometallic polymer component degraded within about 30 seconds, leaving a residue of gray-white powder on the conduit casing. It fell apart. Cut off from its network, isolated from the signal, it could not maintain itself. I stood there holding the plasma cutter and looking at the gray powder for a long time. Then I finished the bypass. ARTA managed the cutover, and the relay arrays stayed online. When the bypass seal was set and tested and confirmed good, I sat down on the floor of Section 2 Alpha with my back against the opposite wall and my knees up, and my damaged right hand pressed flat against my leg to stop it shaking. I sat there for a while. On day 103, the lockdown lifted. ARTA detected surface radiation levels dropping below the threshold that triggered Sigma-4 protocol, ran the full environmental check, and unsealed the ossuary's external access points in sequence. The main personnel elevator shaft was clear. The emergency egress tunnels were clear. I stood at the base of the main shaft and looked up at the closed iris of the elevator door 50 meters above me, and I thought about going up. I didn't go up, not yet. I went back to the command hub first because ARTA had flagged something. The uplink to command had restored when the lockdown lifted, and in the backlog of messages that had queued during the communication blackout, there was an intelligence bulletin, fleet level, automatically distributed to all active relay stations in the Meridian Reach, that had been transmitted on day 97. It was about the Vren. Fleet intelligence had confirmed, based on analysis of recovered crystalline material from 3 facilities that had been cleared by combat teams, that the Vren were using human relay infrastructure as a distributed communication network. The crystalline substrate colonies embedded in conduit systems could transmit and receive signal over significant distances. In facilities that the Vren had successfully colonized, they had established, the bulletin used this phrase, long-range vibration, relay networks that extended their communication range by orders of magnitude. The ossuary, the signal from the north, the deposits in the conduit runs, it was exactly what I thought it was. The bulletin concluded with a tactical note. Substrate colonies that are isolated from their wider network, cut off from the vibration relay, appear to collapse rapidly. The material degrades. The intelligence is lost. Disrupting connectivity between substrate nodes is as effective as destroying individual nodes and significantly less hazardous to infrastructure. I read that last sentence 3 times. Then I typed to ARTA, that's what we did. ARTA, correct. The acoustic disruption via the resonance dampers reduced internode signal coherence. The conduit section removal in Section 2 Alpha severed the primary relay path through the facility. Based on post-event sensor data, substrate colony material in the ossuary has degraded by an estimated 87% over the past 5 days. Remaining material appears non-functional. Non-functional, you mean dead. ARTA, The term is appropriate if we accept that the substrate colonies constitute a living system. Yes. And the signal from the north. ARTA. Passive monitoring since lockdown lift has detected no further transmissions from the northern hemisphere origin point. This is consistent with the collapse of the relay network that was using the ossuary as a node. Without the ossuary's conduit infrastructure to extend its reach, the northern transmitter's signal would not reach any other active relay station in the network. I sat back. I thought about that. The ossuary had been a node in a network the Vren were building, a relay that extended their communication reach across the Meridian Reach, using human infrastructure the same way we used it, turning our own relay network against us. Without the ossuary node, the northern transmitter was isolated. Whatever it was, whatever it had been trying to coordinate, it was now talking to no one. I thought about the timing again. The surface event on day 93. The lockdown. The Vren and the conduits had been patient, growing slowly, integrating deeply, waiting. And then something on the surface had changed, and the signal from the north had started transmitting, and the plan, whatever it was, had been ready to execute. And then a sergeant on lateral injury disability, a man who was here because he wanted some quiet and a pension bump, had woken up on day 78 and noticed a hum. I went up the elevator shaft on day 103, and I stood on the surface of Castle's moon for the first time in 13 days, and I looked at what the bombardment had done. It was extensive. The surface structures, sensor pylons, atmospheric monitoring equipment, the communications mast that wasn't strictly necessary, but that I'd always found reassuring when I looked at it on the surface cameras, were gone. The landscape was scorched and pitted, and would not be safe to operate in without a hardsuit for months. Whatever had happened up here had been systematic. Someone had wanted the surface of this moon denied to human operation. But the ossuary was intact. The relay arrays were online. The relay network in the Meridian Reach was functioning. I went back down. I had a report to write. The full report took 2 days. I wrote it carefully, because it mattered that command understood exactly what had happened, exactly how the Vren had operated, exactly what the acoustic disruption method had accomplished, and exactly what they needed to look for in every other relay station in the network. ARTA helped me format it. She flagged 2 sections where my technical language was imprecise, and I corrected them. When I transmitted the report, I got a response from command within 2 hours fast, for relay lag, which told me someone at the processing node was monitoring incoming traffic closely. The response was short. They had received the report. They were acting on it. Acoustic survey teams were being dispatched to 12 other relay installations in the Meridian Reach. I was to maintain my post and continue operating the arrays. Resupply and personnel relief would be arranged when circumstances permitted. The last line said, "Outstanding work." I read that twice, then I typed to ARTA. They said outstanding work. ARTA, that assessment is accurate. I almost laughed. Instead, I got up and ran my laps. I do not know how many other relay stations had Vren colonies in their conduit runs. I know that the acoustic survey teams found substrate material in 7 of the 12 stations they checked, in varying stages of integration. I know that the disruption and isolation method worked in all 7 cases, that it was significantly less damaging to infrastructure than any alternative approach, and that it did not require specialized equipment that a solo technician in a deep facility posting would not have on hand. I know that the northern transmitter was eventually located and destroyed by a fleet combat team 4 months after my report. It was not what I had imagined, not a Vren facility in the human sense, nothing as concrete as a building or a base. It was a concentrated substrate colony in a subsurface rock formation, a crystalline mass 3 meters across that had been growing there, patiently, in the dark, for longer than the human settlement of Castle's moon had existed. The war continued. Wars do. The math did not improve as fast as anyone wanted. But the relay network in the Meridian Reach stayed operational. And there is a category of intelligence now, filed under methods of engagement, distributed to every station operator in the frontier systems, that describes what the Vren do when they move into sealed infrastructure. What to listen for, what the deposits look like, how to disrupt the network before it matures, how isolation defeats them more surely than any weapon. That category exists because I woke up on a Tuesday morning and the hum was different. I stayed in the ossuary for the full 14 months. I ran my laps. I kept my routine. I talked to ARTA and ARTA talked back, and the crystalline residue in the conduit runs turned to powder, and the powder settled into the corners of the tunnels where it would stay until someone cleaned it up or the facility was eventually decommissioned, whenever that might be. On the last day of my posting, I walked every section of the ossuary one final time. Every tunnel, every conduit run, every sealed bulkhead. I looked at the walls and the pipes and the floor where the deposits had been. In some sections, you could still see the faint gray staining where the material had degraded. In Section 7 Gamma, at the base of the emergency bulkhead where I had first crouched and looked at a crystal the size of my thumbnail and thought, that shouldn't be there, I stood for a long time. Then I walked back to the command hub and I typed, ARTA, I'm leaving today. The relief team will be here in 6 hours. You've been good company. ARTA, you have maintained this facility effectively under adverse conditions. I would say it has been a professional working relationship that this system is unlikely to replicate with the same characteristics. I read that twice. It was the closest ARTA ever came to saying she would miss me. I'm going to assume she meant it. The relief team arrived. I briefed them thoroughly. I left the sample tubes, both of them, the original from Section 7 Gamma and the one from Section 4, Delta, in the evidence locker where I had filed them, properly labeled with full chain of custody documentation. I left my complete maintenance logs and my acoustic monitoring records and a 3-page supplementary note on things to listen for that wasn't in any official manual. I walked out of the ossuary and onto the shuttle, and I did not look back. Some things you look back at, some things you just carry. The hum is what I carry. On bad nights I still hear it, not in a haunted way, not the way a damaged man hears things that aren't there, but in the way that a thing you listen to hard enough becomes part of how you listen. I hear the ambient sound of whatever room I'm in, and I notice when it changes. I notice the subharmonics. I notice the variations. It's not a bad thing to carry. In my experience, it's the things you were too busy to notice that kill you. The things you heard and dismissed. The things that shouldn't be there that you decided weren't worth crouching down to look at. I crouched down, that's all. That's the whole of it. I crouched down and I looked, and I did not stop looking until I understood what I was looking at. Whatever the Vren learned from the Meridian Reach, and they learned slowly, the way geology learns, I hope they learned that. That the humans in those quiet, deep, under-monitored facilities are not empty space. That we notice. That we are made for exactly this kind of slow, stubborn, irrational attention. That we will crouch in a cold tunnel and look at a thing the size of our thumbnail, and something in us will say, that shouldn't be there. And we will not let it go.